Welcome to day 197 on the trail. We have three readings for today from Mark chapter 4 verses 1 through 25, 2 Samuel 13 verses 22 through 39, 3 Maccabees chapter 2 verses 1 through 24. In our reading from the Gospel of Mark today, we will explore the parable of the sower. Such a large crowd had gathered that day to hear Jesus that he was forced to get into a boat to teach the people while they sat on the shore. The parable itself is likely quite familiar, and we will discuss it shortly. But first, I would like to start with Jesus' private comments to his disciples about the use of parables. When Jesus ends the parable of the sower before the crowd, he calls the crowd back to the first word that he spoke to them that day. Listen. So he concludes the parable by saying to them in verse 9, "Let anyone with ears to hear, listen." The implication here is that not everyone who hears the words of Jesus will truly listen to him or make the effort to understand him. We will see something similar later in Mark when the disciples ask about the bread, when Jesus warns them about the yeast of the Pharisees and Herod. The disciples have spent a great deal of time with Jesus, and as we will see in the interpretation of the parable of the sower given later by Jesus in chapter 4, they have had many opportunities to listen to the teaching of Jesus and ask him questions. Nevertheless, we sometimes find them not listening to him. So let's take a brief look at the story of when the disciples asked Jesus about the bread. In Mark chapter 8, beginning in verse 17, "And becoming aware of it, Jesus said to them, 'Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? And do you not remember?'" Therefore, Jesus' statement in Mark chapter 4, verse 9 calls for a responsible listening, which leads us to one of the most difficult statements from Jesus in Mark's Gospel. Mark chapter 4, beginning in verse 10. "When he was alone, those who were around him, along with the 12, asked him about the parables. And he said to them, 'To you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God. But for those outside, everything comes in parables, in order that they may indeed look, but not perceive, and may indeed listen, but not understand, so that they may not turn again and be forgiven.'" This statement is indeed difficult. However, as we saw in the previous encounter between Jesus and the Pharisees and the Herodians, Jesus was facing strong opposition and therefore begins to speak in more veiled ways. And therefore, we see a stronger distinction between those who are insiders, that is, those who accept Jesus and his teaching, and those who do not. Now, to those on the outside, Jesus will speak in parables. This does not mean that what Jesus is teaching is hidden from them. The point of Jesus' teaching is the same. After all, as we saw in verse 3, Jesus warns them to really listen. However, if the outsiders are not truly committed to honestly listening to the words of Jesus and accepting his identification with the kingdom of God, then they will not understand. In this way, the parables of Jesus clearly identify those who are outsiders and those who are insiders. However, those on the inside, those who have accepted Jesus and his teaching, are also warned by Jesus to continue listening. Beginning in verse 24, he says this, "And he said to them, 'Pay attention to what you hear, for the measure you give will be the measure you get, and still more will be given you. For to those who have, more will be given, and from those who have nothing, Even what they have will be taken away. The hardest part to understand Jesus' statement here comes in verse 12, so that they may not turn again and be forgiven. While this statement from Jesus does seem very harsh, it must be understood within the context of Mark's gospel up to this point. Only in the face of such strong rejection does Jesus turn to his disciples with an interpretation that is clear to them but repelling to outsiders. Also, we should note that we have been given the interpretation of the parables from the disciples of Jesus. In Mark's gospel, both the parable and the interpretation have been made known to the world. Therefore, this is not hidden or restricted information offered to a chosen few. Instead, this statement from Jesus is focused on the opposition to Jesus at the time. Now, generally, the parable of the sower itself is easy to understand and relatively transparent. There are a few important points, however, that might be helpful. First, the sower is broadcasting seed into his field. That is, he is walking along, spreading seed everywhere. Here we see that God is not stingy or limiting in his message. None of the soils mentioned in the parable are left out. No small bit of ground can say, "Why not me?" God's message of forgiveness, redemption, and growth is available to all. Second, let's briefly review each of the soils as they are the centerpiece of the parable. The first soil, the path, is described in verse 15. These are the ones on the path where the word is sown. When they hear, Satan immediately comes and takes away the word that is sown in them. The path hears the words of Jesus, but does not take any action. They allow the teachings of Jesus to remain on the surface of their lives. And due to their indifference and lack of care, what they have been so graciously given is taken from them. Instead of asking questions or making any effort to understand, they shrug their shoulders and go on about their lives. The second soil, the rock, is found in verse 16 and 17. And these are the ones sown on rocky ground. When they hear the word, they immediately receive it with joy, but they have no root, and endure only for a while. Then, when trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately they fall away. The rocky ground allows the seed to begin to germinate and grow. However, the soil is thin, and stones and rocks have not been removed. Hard and immovable places are ignored and remain in their souls. So when difficulties arise, there is no root that can sustain them. We see this in the deserts of Arizona. In the spring, rains fall on the rocky mountainous terrain. Life sprouts forth, painting the hills green. But the season is short-lived. As summer approaches and temperatures rise, these young plants quickly wither under the blazing sun. But unlike these desert plants, those who hear the word of Christ are not helpless. They know summer is coming. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus repeatedly warns us of the difficulties and persecution that we will face when we decide to follow him. Therefore, while it is spring, we should be working to identify and remove those hard places within us: pride, impatience, arrogance, anger, and fear. Stones of self-centeredness that are preventing us from deeply rooting ourselves in the love of Christ. The third soil is the thorns. Beginning in verse 18. And others are those sown among the thorns. These are the ones who hear the word, but the cares of the world and the lure of wealth and the desire for other things come in and choke the word, and it yields nothing. The field has been cleared, and the soil has been prepared. Life grows in this kind of soil. However, there is another threat that is unseen, a threat that takes advantage of the work that has been done so far. The good seed is not the only seed that has been sown. These unseen seeds are lying beneath the surface. As the good seed springs forth from the ground, so do these unwanted plants. Their roots become entangled. They steal critical resources from the soil and threaten to choke life from the good plants. In high school, I worked on a farm in Indiana, and one of my jobs was weeding entire soybean fields. This did not mean driving a John Deere tractor up and down the rows, listening to music while spraying the weeds. This particular farmer was far more hands-on. So for us, this meant that we spent our hot and humid summers walking acres of soybean fields, pulling 3-foot tall weeds from the ground. We did this not only for the current crop, but to prevent the seeds from the weeds from falling into the ground and damaging next year's crop. This farmer knew how dangerous weeds can be. If you ignore them, they can ruin everything that you have worked for. But this is not the greatest danger of the spiritual weeds and thorns that Jesus mentions here. Instead, the greatest threat of the weeds is that we can get used to them. In our complacency, we ignore them, or we believe that they are not that dangerous. How many children have tried to convince their mothers that dandelions were really a beautiful bouquet of flowers? Finally, we come to the good soil. Verse 20. And these are the ones sown on the good soil. They hear the word and accept it and bear fruit, 30 and 60 and 100-fold. When the soil has been prepared, the rocks, stones, and weeds removed, the potential for growth is astounding. We see this when we drive by a cornfield in the Midwest. A single kernel of corn, placed in the ground during the spring, becomes a stalk with 2 or 3 ears of corn per plant. Each ear has 400 to 600 new kernels. Therefore, one single seed can yield well over 2,000 kernels of corn. In the same way, God can produce immeasurable fruit from soil that is well prepared. But that means we cannot leave our soil the way it is today. We cannot say, well, I am just a path, or I am just rocky soil. That's who I am. Or I have learned to live with the weeds and they're not all that bad. Instead, this parable of Jesus calls us to prepare our lives for the good work God can do in us and through us. Thank you for joining us today. Until next time, stay on the trail.